Well, this is a fine little museum here in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but why are we here, Jeff?
We're looking for a quilt, Ray, and it's an old one. It dates back to 1768.
Wow, but what's so special about it?
Well, it once belonged to Ruth Blay, and she holds the distinction of being the last woman hanged in New Hampshire. She died for what was found inside this quilt, and some say she's haunted the South Street Cemetery ever since due to a grave injustice. Hello, I'm Jeff Belanger.
And I'm Ray Auger, and welcome to the New England Legends Podcast, where each week we explore the history, legends, and lore of the Northeast. All right, I guess my first question is, why is she haunting the cemetery, and what was found in that quilt?
That's two questions.
I know, I'm sorry, I'll probably have much more too, but let's start at the beginning.
Okay, when we're talking about a ghost story, it's best to start at the end, and that's why we're here at the museum, to see this quilt. If the quilt is real, then it adds a lot more credence to Ruth Blay's story and ghost. So let's set the stage.
Ruth Blay's story begins in 1768. Ruth was a 25-year-old school teacher and beloved in the town of Portsmouth until she got pregnant out of wedlock. In those days, that was absolutely scandalous. She concealed the pregnancy from most people, but a few knew. And even before the days of Facebook, people talked. You have to understand all the dirty looks she would have received as her belly grew. How parents of school children would question whether she was fit to teach their kids. How she would be shunned by the church and community. Ruth's life was ruined forever.
And no one knew how short that life would be on June 10th, 1768.
Well, what happened on June 10th?
On June 10th, Ruth Blay gave birth to a baby girl. But according to Ruth, the baby was stillborn. So she wrapped the infant in a quilt and placed it in a nearby barn, we assume to bury it later when she was in a better mental and physical state. But just 3 days after, 5-year-old Betsy Pettingill of Salisbury was visiting her uncle who owned the barn. She went exploring as kids often do and found this quilt in the corner. She unwrapped it and was horrified by what she found.
I can't imagine what that must have been like for a 5-year-old. So what happened next?
Betsy Pettingill lived to be 105 years old and claimed even in her old age that what she saw in that quilt that day has haunted her ever since. After the dead infant was discovered, people quickly suspected Ruth Blay. Some knew she was pregnant, and when they went to her home, they saw she was no longer with child and no infant could be found. Blay contended the child was stillborn, and she was waiting to give it a proper burial, but English laws were just not on her side.
All right, I'm reading the charges against her here. It says, and I quote, concealing the birth of a bastard child so that it might not come to light, whether said child was born alive or not. Under British law, this crime comes with the death penalty.
Ruth spent the rest of the summer in jail until the fall when she was tried and convicted. Judge Wiseman Claggett decreed the hanging should take place November 24th.
Well, this seems pretty harsh if the baby really was stillborn.
The people of Portsmouth felt the same way, Ray, and no one was happy about this young woman losing her life considering the circumstances. The complaints made their way all the way up to the governor's office. Provincial Governor John Wentworth deferred Blay's execution until December 9th, and then she was issued another reprieve until December 23rd, and then finally it was decided December 30th would be her day of execution. The hanging was to take place at the gallows that were erected on the corner of what is now South Street and Sagamore Avenue in Portsmouth. But the story gets worse for poor Ruth.
How could it get worse than facing the gallows?
Read this from the June 5th, 1971 Portsmouth Herald describing what happened next.
All right, it says, the warrant for execution read between 12 and 2 o'clock December 30th, but the 12 has been crossed out and 10 was inserted. Why would somebody change the time?
The rumor was that it was Sheriff Thomas Packer who changed the times.
Well, why did he do that?
Sheriff Packer had recently boasted that he would be hanging the third woman of his career. He'd already hanged Sarah Simpson and Penelope Kenny in 1739 for the murder of a child and a man, and now Ruth Blay would be his third. He moved the time earlier because he wanted to get home in time for dinner so that it wouldn't get cold.
That's horrible. I'm reading some eyewitness accounts of the hanging that say Ruth Blay shrieked and screamed on the way to the gallows. The assembled crowd could only look on in horror as she stood on a horse-drawn carriage. The rope was placed around her neck, and then the horse was whipped, sending him into a trot, pulling the cart out from under Ruth Blay and snapping her neck.
Ruth Blay was hanged at 10 a.m., 2 hours earlier than the court decree. At 10:30 a.m., a messenger on horseback raced to the gallows with another reprieve from the governor. Had the execution time not been moved, Ruth Blay may have lived.
Well, this makes me furious that a sheriff would value his dinner over doing his job when it comes to the life of a person who really was a victim of circumstance more than anything.
It made the townspeople furious as well. That night, an angry mob gathered by Sheriff Packer's house and hanged an effigy of the sheriff with a sign that read, "Am I to lose my dinner? This woman for to hang? Come draw away the cart, my boys. Don't stop to say amen."
Was the sheriff ever punished?
No, he wasn't. He lived out to a ripe old age and died wealthy. He's buried in North Union Cemetery.
The 1971 Portsmouth Herald article mentions that the infamous quilt made it into the Portsmouth Historical Society's collection, and here it is now in storage. Also, I noticed that we haven't mentioned the father of Ruth Blay's bastard child once.
No, we haven't. I found no record of who he was. He isn't mentioned or deemed relevant.
This is the part that's most infuriating to me. Ruth Blay was unjustly hanged by the sheriff, who was more concerned with his dinner than following the law or doing the right thing. It's systematic sexism using lethal means. No wonder her ghost still haunts us.
I agree, and we should continue this story over at the corner of South Street and Sagamore Avenue. Okay, we're here. Tell me what you see.
Let's see. I see a pretty large cemetery and a small pond just down a slight hill.
Though locals call this South Street Cemetery, it's actually 5 cemeteries in one. One is called Elmwood, another Harmony Grove, there's Proprietor's Burying Ground, Sagamore, and Cotton. But we're mainly concerned of the area of Proprietor's Burying Ground and Harmony Grove.
If the gallows were right here, I'm guessing that means Ruth Blay's grave is over there?
Records indicate Ruth Blay was buried in an unmarked grave just north of that pond in the vicinity of modern-day Proprietor's Burying Ground and Harmony Grove.
She doesn't even get a proper burial?
No, she doesn't. But her hanging would serve as the last public hanging of a woman in New Hampshire. The public didn't have the stomach for it after Ruth Blay, and society changed. 25 years after her death, lawmakers ruled that concealment would no longer be punishable by death.
All right, fast forward to 1971, and the Portsmouth Historical Society receives a donation of this infamous quilt for their museum. And now the local cemetery is haunted.
I think most old cemeteries earn a ghostly reputation at some point. That often has more to do with the living than the dead. If you were a ghost and you could haunt anywhere, would you choose to haunt a cemetery?
No way. I'd be haunting the front row of the best concert venues, or maybe the 50-yard line at Gillette.
I'm with you there. But when you walk into a cemetery, you can't help but think about your own mortality. There are countless bones beneath your feet, and you know deep inside of you that this place right here is your ultimate destination. Even if not this particular cemetery, you're heading for a boneyard at some point, just like these fellow travelers to the grave who arrived here ahead of you.
That fear, I'm sure, makes us more open to all things ghostly. But there's another wrinkle at South Street Cemetery. The hangman's gallows were once right here, and Ruth Blay was killed in this spot, and her body lies somewhere nearby. Honestly, I'm getting shivers just thinking about it.
People have reported strange ghostly lights in this boneyard. Sometimes witnesses say they've heard the shrieks and cries of Ruth Blay in the breeze, especially on winter's days like this one.
Well, she truly does haunt us.
As well she should. Sometimes society fails its people. What was done to Ruth was the worst kind of oppression and sexism to women. Had she not tried to conceal her pregnancy and stillborn child, she would have been completely ruined in her community. She wouldn't be able to work, live, or even feed herself. By trying to hide the pregnancy and stillborn child, she at least had a chance. If you think about it, she was facing the death penalty either way.
Every Thursday, we bring you a new installment of the New England Legends podcast. And if you visit our website at ournewenglandlegends.com, you can find pictures and more information on each episode. You can even post comments and send us story suggestions.
At our website, you can also watch segments from my New England Legends television series on PBS and Amazon Prime.
Until next time, remember, the bizarre is closer than you think.